Hi, my name is Daniel. I'm the owner and founder of the Raminfard School of Arts. I'd like to welcome you back to our channel, and today we're going to be talking about the fundamentals of drawing, in particular a shape that is so common and, in my opinion, so fundamental to drawing. It's probably the first thing that you should know how to draw, and that is the ball. I think one of the most challenging things about learning how to draw in general is understjanding the idea of constructing something rather than outlining it. And what I mean by that is when we start to draw, it is very tempting to look at something like the eye and just simply outline exactly what we see. It never comes out right doing it that way. But it's because of a lack of information. It's a lack of understanding a process. And what that process is using a constructive technique in which you actually build something out. For example, starting with a ball and then drawing the lids around that ball and then drawing the iris and then drawing the pupil and so on and so forth. Our brains are designed to take information and categorize it immediately. And so this is where things actually get pretty challenging. So if I give you a list of shoe companies, which I can't mention because we're on YouTube, but if I give you a whole list of those shoe companies, you would immediately categorize them into the shoe bin. And same thing visually, if I give you a list of fruits, apples, oranges, cherries, bananas, so on and so forth, your brain categorizes it and puts it off, and you move forward with whatever you're doing. What drawing requires us to do is actually pull back the image of the banana and actually look at the angles, the shape, the color, the value, the edges that make up this item. So it can be very challenging. I think that we need to take it step by step. I think that we really need to slow down and look carefully. And I think that watching other people do it is going to also be of benefit to us. So hopefully this video helps you out. If you have any questions, please put it in the comments. Please like and share. And I hope to see you in the next video. So the core concept is to learn how to draw this simple ball that's here in front of you now. Before we get started, I want to lay down some key concepts in drawing. And what I'm going to do is draw out a pyramid to indicate the three most essential things that we need to worry about when we're drawing. The first will always be shape. Shape is so important that I would say that all visual two-dimensional art, and maybe even all visual three-dimensional art, is basically shape management. That's how important shape is. Then what matters is value, your lights and darks, and then finally edges. So these are the three things that we're going to consider when we're working monochromatically. What I mean by shapes are the most fundamental, basic things that we can think of. And that would be a circle, a triangle, and a square. Those three shapes are as fundamental and as basic as it gets. Those are the kinds of things that you're looking for when you're drawing. In terms of value, what I'm talking about is lights and darks. I'm talking about how well your darks, your mediums, and your lights read. A lot of this was covered in a video called Light Logic, and I highly recommend that you watch that. But here we're talking about shapes, we're talking about values, and finally talking about edges. Edges can be broken down into four basic categories. The first is going to be a clean, crisp line, which I just put down right now. The second would be something called a firm line, where it's not quite crystal clear exactly where the line is, but it's somewhere within a tight range. The next would be a soft line. A soft line or a soft edge is something like hair, where it's not really clear where the line really is, but it's somewhere within a little bit of a wider range than what you would call a firm edge. And then finally, the last thing is called a lost edge. Now, a lost edge is very much like the drawing that I just made below it, which is one of value. So if you look, you'll see that the black fades off into the white, and that's essentially a lost edge right there in front of you. Let's look at the supplies I'm using. Here I have gray tone paper with a Faber-Castell pencil. It's a colored pencil, and this is dark sepia, which is one of my favorite colors to work with. Next I have a Factis eraser. So it's basically a pencil clicker with an eraser in the center. This right here is a white pencil, colored pencil, made by Prismacolor. Both Faber-Castell and Prisma are fantastic brands, so I use them interchangeably. I have a Tortoloin, which is a twisted up piece of newsprint paper used for blending. This is a knead eraser, so you can kind of pull it apart and twist it up into the shape that you want, which is ideal for an artist. So now, using these materials, what I want to do is draw the ball. And one of the things that you'll notice is how I'm holding my pencil. I'm holding it using what's known as a drafter's grip or an overhand grip. And the idea behind this is that it allows me to draw using my shoulder. We'll talk a little bit more about that grip a little later on. But for now, just know that the intent is that you're drawing from the shoulder rather than from the wrist or the elbow. And I'm using multiple lines until I find a line that I really like. Now what I'm doing is I'm checking to see if this ball is even. So I'm just taking a quick measurement, top to bottom, side to side, and going in diagonals. So everything looks good so far. So the next step that I'm going to take is I'm actually going to draw a line going directly across the ball. And the reason why I'm doing that is I'm looking from corner to corner to see where the shadows line up. So really I'm dividing the ball into two essential shapes. Shape number one is where the light hits, and shape number two is where the shadow is. So we commonly refer to this as form shadow. So as I look at the ball from here, I'm going to take a measurement and see what is the angle at which the shadow casts onto the table. And that's the angle that I'm getting. I'm also drawing a line from underneath the ball to where I believe the very end of the shadow is. And that gives me a clear understanding of what the shadow form looks like. And basically, to the best of my ability looking at it, what I see is a ellipse. And that elliptical form is also going to be shaded. Now notice that I am not shading it immediately into the value that I actually see there. And there's a reason for that, because I want something that's workable and manageable, meaning that I don't want the value too dark. Here's where I talk about grip. Okay, so look at how I'm holding the pencil. I'm pinching it with two fingers underneath as if I'm speaking into a mic or holding an ice cream cone. And that allows me to draw from the shoulder. So I wanted you guys to see that. And back to the drawing I go by adding additional value. So I'm just getting it just slightly darker than the ball. So at this point, I'm going to actually start to address edges. And the way that I'm going to do it is using the best tool of all, my finger. I'm just going to blur this all out and try to get a nice even tone, indicating a clear distinction between light and shadow, right? So I've got my shadow shape, both in terms of the form shadow as well as the cast shadow. Okay, so now I'm going to reach over and grab my kneaded eraser. And it's time for me to do some cleanup work. So all of the construction lines are now disappearing. And I think one of the things I want to drive home is how important it is that we construct things rather than to outline them. I think that's the number one mistake that everybody makes. Okay, so it's a good time for me to indicate where my lightest tone is, and I'm going to bring in my colored pencil. So this is a white colored pencil against the gray toned paper, and I'm going to start to add in this white tone. I like working this way because it really forces me to work directly on value, on how light and dark things really are. Because basically everybody wants to jump into color, but if their values don't read well, then their drawing or painting just doesn't work. It doesn't have the sufficient amount of degrees of change in tone that make it read like it's actually realistic. So this way, when you're working in black and white, or in this case sepia and white, you're really focused on where the lights and darks are and what is in between your lights, your mids, and your darks. This is a good time to talk about edge. I'm creating a shape here, but notice how soft my edges are. So again, notice how I'm holding the pencil. And the amount of pressure that I'm actually using, the pencil just slides out of my hand because I'm not using a super firm grip. However, for the area where it is brightest, I am going to use a much tighter grip. That pencil is not going anywhere. So I'm going to speed this up so that I can get to the part where I actually use the blender. I'm now using a blender to really soften things up. And that is the tortillon that I showed you guys earlier. The intent here is to really soften those edges, because the softer I make those edges, the rounder the object will look. So before I actually go back into the shadow and really emphasize how dark that area is, I'm going to add a little tone to the background of the ball. And the reason why I'm doing that is because one thing I know is that by creating contrast, I will develop a greater sense of light on the object, because our eyes look at things comparatively. We actually don't see value as objectively as we should. The way that we see it is comparatively compared to other objects. So here's where I finally actually get into making the shadows darker. And everybody wants to move as quickly as they can in this stage, and they should not. It's very important that we slowly build into darker and darker values, because when you do it too quickly, you usually overshoot it, and then it throws the entire drawing off balance. Once I add something super dark, it will actually lighten the rest of my drawing. So I want to be really careful. Just like a seesaw, I'm slowly balancing out the drawing. Now what you'll notice is that the shadow gets much sharper and much darker as it gets closer to the object. And this is true about almost all shadows. So you want to pay close attention to where the shadow is darkest and where it is lightest. It's going to be lightest and softest on the side that's farthest away from the object, darkest and sharpest on the side that it is closest to the object. So you can see now how adding that really dark shadow there is lightening the rest of the drawing. Pay close attention to the other parts of the drawing and you'll see that it looks relatively light now. So I actually have to now, again, using the seesaw metaphor, add more weight to the shadow parts to bring this drawing back into balance. Getting into the form shadow of the object. So this is the part of the shadow that belongs to the actual form that we're drawing, which in this case is a ball. I'm now going to darken and add more tone so that the ball reads as round as I can make it. As I do this, I'm concerned with the part of the shadow that is darkest versus the part of the shadow that is lightest. So I'm coming in with this line and I'm actually going to darken where it's closest to the object, because that's what I'm seeing in the image that I'm looking at. At a certain point, I need to marry the two sides where there's light and there's shadow. So I'm going to add just a touch more tone, and then I'm going to use my finger, knowing that it's got a little bit of residue on there, and I'm going to blend as best as I can, because again, the more transitions that I have here, meaning that it's going from one value into another, and the more blending that I do, the rounder my object is going to look. So I'm finally starting to get the kind of roundness that I'm looking for, but I need to keep adding value and keep blending it. You could do this with your blender, with the tortillon, but I prefer to do it with the finger because it's just faster. So having done that, it feels as if the other side of the object isn't showing bright enough. So it's a real simple solution. I'm just going to add more tone to get a little bit more pop. Adding more white isn't going to work. So in this case, I'm going to add just a touch more tone. That doesn't mean I can't add a little bit more glow. And what that is adding a little bit more to the sides of that bright shape. So I'm going to go over the object and color that in very lightly. especially towards the edge, to just get a bit more punch. So it's not like I'm adding a whole ton of white. I'm just trying to get a little bit more in there, as much as I can squeeze in without hyper compressing my values. So once I have that in, now the ball looks nice and round.